And so here we are with the last of the classic Resident Evil titles before the series took on a whole new direction with the fourth main installment, and this one's a prequel. Resident Evil 0, originally releasing for the GameCube in 2002 for North America and Japan, and then shipped out to Europe in 2003, took place just before the events of the very first Resident Evil, following the adventures of our favorite Bravo team medic from Stars, Rebecca Chambers.
Okay, I'm playing it off as if Rebecca's some sort of staple in the Resident Evil series and she's like this super important character. But no, she's actually kinda forgotten at this point in time. She made her debut in the original Resident Evil during Chris's scenario, became a main character in 0, and then just vanished off the face of the earth. She does appear in the Resident Evil Vendetta movie and is even playable in side projects like the Umbrella Chronicles and Resident Evil 5's Mercenaries mode, but in terms of major roles, Rebecca's only got these 2 games under her belt. 3, I guess, if you count the first remake. Shame too, I didn't really mind her in the original game, I thought she was fine. But she could have maybe had potential in sequels, starting off as an inexperienced 18-year-old medic for Stars, working her way to a badass zombie hunting veteran further down the line. Hey, it did well for Leon Kennedy between Resident Evils 2 and 4, why not do the same for Rebecca? Resident Evil 0 started off as a Nintendo 64 exclusive, which you're able to find footage of on YouTube pretty easily if you're curious to check it out for yourself. But Capcom specifically wanted to utilize the 64DD peripheral that allowed floppy disks to run on the Nintendo 64 for more graphical power and memory, similar to what Zelda Majora's Mask initially intended to do. The 64DD, however, was a commercial failure, so it was back to using traditional cartridges for Capcom, and development started in the middle of 1998, along with a few other Resident Evil games such as Code Veronica for the Dreamcast, which I covered a couple of years ago if you want to check out that review. Capcom were seriously busy with Resident Evil games at this time. There were separate teams working on each title, but the second entry had just come out, 3 was on the way, and then Code Veronica would follow to continue the main story. Good lord, talk about overkill. I mean, what other studio would do such a thing, really? The quality did show at a few points compared to the time and effort that was actually put in, but thankfully for Resident Evil 3 and Code Veronica, they both have their good moments, though personally I had way more fun with Resident Evil 3 than I did with Code Veronica. Koji Oda was in the directing chair for 0 and would eventually take charge of other Capcom titles like the 2014 Strider, Mega Man 11, and would even become the monster designer for Monster Hunter Rise. After having realized that maybe too much data is needed to store Resident Evil 0 onto a cartridge, development started to slow down, and then as soon as the GameCube got announced, that was it. The N64 version was no more, and production immediately went over to the GameCube, starting everything from scratch except for the initial idea of 0 and its story. What I'll be using, however, is the 2016 HD remaster that got bundled with an HD version of REmake 1. Back when I talked about the original Resident Evil, I brought up the Wii version of the remake as the go-to port at the time, since that had several different control options and widescreen support, which I still have by the way after all these years. Never owns the Wii port for 0 though. But in 2023, you're now better off getting the HD remasters for both with a smoother resolution and the option to have proper analog movement instead of tank controls. Oh, thank Christ. I've never really had that much of an issue with the tank controls outside of maybe a few occasions, but it does get a little bit tiring after a while when you just want to get a move on with things and have to wait for the character to rotate to where you want to go first. The constant change in camera angles does consistently force you to readjust the direction you're going, which I can see causing issues for some players. The game was intentionally designed with a tank setup in mind to add stress and tension and not make the different camera angles feel too intrusive. But now that I've experienced what it feels like to play a classic Resident Evil in a more modern fashion, I don't think I can go back. Exaggerating, of course, I'll always be happy to play games like the PS1 trilogy again, but if I'm playing the first remake in 0, I'm using those alternate controls. I've kind of forgotten just how fun REmake 1 is as well. The atmosphere is still absolutely incredible 21 years later as one of the creepiest games I've ever played, and the exploration, puzzle solving, and zombie shooting gameplay is as enjoyable as it ever was. Sure, the puzzles themselves may not be the most difficult, but they're not utterly brain dead either. I mentioned in my older video that the game does kinda add some padding through returning puzzles from the PS1 title taking longer to solve by finding more pieces, and the higher quality voice acting might not be as charmingly disastrous as the original, both of which may be to the remake's detriment. However, I think it more than makes up for it with its tense environments, do-or-die situations, scary and dangerous as hell enemies, especially ones like the Crimson Heads and those goddamn hunters, with a story and characters that are simple but effective, and back when things weren't quite as batshit crazy easy as they are now. If I'm playing this game nowadays though, I'm usually picking Jill over Chris. She can't take as many hits as Chris, but her lockpicking skills and expanded inventory exponentially help reduce backtracking. Chris's health pool's great and all, and in the remake it's good that he always has a lighter on him for certain puzzles and burning zombie bodies to decrease the number of crimson heads, but using small keys instead of lockpicking takes up an unnecessary amount of space in your already limited inventory, so it might be best just to take a single gun until you next reach an item box. Chris is essentially the hard mode of the game, but I have more fun overall playing as Jill than I do as Chris. The BSAA outfit from RE5's cool at least, and even Jill gets hers. No idea what's with this skater boy outfit though, and not too crazy about Rebecca's cowgirl getup either. Both are tacky as hell, but on the plus side, I beat this game on the hard difficulty for the first time whilst doing Chris's playthrough. If you have to pick one version of the remake to play, however, and this goes for Zero as well, I'd highly recommend getting the PC port of the remaster since you can boost the resolution and frame rate even further. I was originally planning on using the PS4 versions of both games to capture footage for this video, but for some reason they can only do up to 30 FPS despite running on fairly powerful hardware. Luckily, at around Halloween of 2022, Humble Bundle had an amazing deal that contained every mainline Resident Evil on PC, plus remakes but minus the PS1 titles for a damn good price. I snagged it and was proud to own the batch of games, but by that point I had already completed and recorded the whole of Resident Evil 0 on my PS4, meaning if I wanted to have the higher frame rate, I had to go through the whole game again. So for the sake of this video, I ended up playing 0 twice. I don't know how this sort of thing keeps happening with me in reviewing Resident Evil games for YouTube. I had similar frustrations with Code Veronica X when I did that video. I'm as unlucky as the characters in this damn series. The remasters of the two games are pretty much on every modern console known to man at this point. PlayStation, Xbox, Switch, PC, you name it. There's almost no way you can't play them nowadays, so at the very least go and try REmake 1 when you get the chance. It's absolutely worth it. The only thing I discovered with the HD versions is that because the backgrounds were already pre-rendered in a 4:3 ratio for the GameCube, Capcom had to zoom the game in a tad to ensure widescreen support. Thankfully though, for both experiences, I didn't have any problems navigating the areas. Hell, I didn't know it was zoomed in until afterwards, so I don't really think it's that big of a deal. But we're here to talk about Resident Evil 0, and we should probably start with the plot. Though this definitely won't take long at all, there's barely anything that I would classify as a story in this game.
Resident Evil 0.
A day before everything's set in motion for Resident Evil 1, a train full of people gets attacked by leeches controlled by a man singing opera in the Arklay Mountains.
Okay.
A couple of hours later, STARS' Bravo team are sent to investigate the mountains, which just so happen to be outside of Raccoon City, meaning that things aren't going to be looking so good after this game in the first Resident Evil. Bravo team's helicopter crashes in the forest surrounding the mountains, and while checking it out, Rebecca Chambers comes across the train from earlier, only the passengers and crew have now been turned into zombies thanks to the leeches. Also crashing nearby was a police van holding a former Marine gone convict named Billy Coen, who was on his way to death row for killing 23 people. Though by today's standards, that's rookie numbers compared to the amount of people Nathan Drake's killed. Seeing no other option in getting out of this predicament, Rebecca and Billy need to temporarily team up and eventually get the train working, but now it's speeding out of control. They figure out where the brakes are through some needlessly complicated mechanisms, but the train still ends up getting destroyed and bursting into flames. Their destination leads them to an abandoned Umbrella training facility that belonged to the co-founder of Umbrella, Dr. James Marcus, who discovered something called the progenitor virus in the 1960s and combined it with leech DNA to create the T-virus we should be all familiar with by now, even using humans as experiments including children. And like rats carrying the bubonic plague, the leeches are spread to society, kickstarting the epidemic that's been going on throughout the entire series. Meanwhile, Albert Wesker and William Birkin have plans of their own. As Wesker decides to leave Umbrella and continue researching the T-virus for his own purposes, yeah, good luck with that, while Birkin is hell-bent on completing his experiments with the G-virus, and we all know how that turns out by the second game. Dr. Marcus also had a bit of a rivalry going on with Oswald Spencer, former president of Umbrella and one of the founders, as well as the owner of the mansion from the first game. He tried to steal Marcus's research on the progenitor and T-virus to do his own bidding with it, but we won't discover Spencer's fate until we get to Resident Evil 5, so we'll have to be kept in suspense for now. You later find out that Wesker and Birkin had Dr. Marcus shot down on Spencer's orders, where one of Marcus's leeches then consumes his brain along with his memories, believing to be Dr. Marcus himself, which is why you see his younger form. Leeches and B-movie science does wonders for your complexion, apparently. Billy and Rebecca spend a long while investigating the facility, but Rebecca eventually asks Billy if he really did kill 23 people. Turns out Billy's unit in the Marines were ordered to slaughter a whole bunch of African villagers after checking a guerrilla base nearby, to which Billy refused to cooperate, but the rest of the troops gunned them down anyway, where Billy was framed for their crimes. Now more determined than ever to get Billy out of this situation, he and Rebecca run into one of William Birkin's research labs, where after splitting up temporarily, Rebecca runs into the captain of STARS' Bravo team on Rico, the guy that Jill and Chris come across in the tunnel sections before being shot by an assailant. And just like his fate, he mentions to Rebecca that he and the rest of Bravo team are going to meet up at an old mansion they found, and again, I'm pretty sure we can guess what happens from there. Rebecca refuses to come along anyway until she knows that Billy is safe, where she afterwards fights a prototype tyrant who acts pretty much the same as all the other tyrants, so what exactly makes him a prototype? But with enough firepower, she beats it temporarily, only for it to show up again not much later, and either Billy, Rebecca, or both characters can take it down for good. Finally, at the end of the lab is Dr. Marcus himself, or I should say the Queen Leech that was created by the real Marcus. And because she thinks she's actually Dr. Marcus, she wants to continue his revenge against Umbrella by sending out a swarm of leeches with the T-virus, and hey, mission accomplished I guess if the train's anything to judge it on. So the Queen Leech has pretty much doomed all of humanity already, but Rebecca and Billy defeat her after a couple of boss fights, all the while Birkin activates the self-destruct sequence he set up around the facility should things go south. Our two heroes escape just in time though and say their farewells, with Rebecca declaring Billy dead to anyone who asks, and finds herself near the Spencer mansion from the original game as she heads towards it to meet with the other Bravo team members, cueing Resident Evil 1. Yeah, that's the plot of Resident Evil 0 for you. Like I said, there really isn't much going for it. Aside from Dr. Marcus being the cause of everything that happens in these games, very little is added to the overall lore and doesn't have that great a reason to exist. Despite Marcus basically ending all of mankind as well, he somehow feels less important of an antagonist than the actual main antagonist of the series, Albert Wesker. And aside from the Umbrella Chronicles, which has a basic retelling of Zero, Marcus never shows up in another Resident Evil again. For someone who created such a huge disaster, he's just treated like your generic RE villain that wants to evolve humanity by basically killing them first, in this case using his army of leeches. Also, out of all the characters that could have stopped Marcus, the creator of the T-virus, it had to be Rebecca and Billy to do the job. Rebecca and Billy are the ones who kill Marcus, one character who barely makes an appearance in anything related to Resident Evil after this game, and another character who only had this single title under his belt. You know what, let's talk about him too. What an absolute charisma vacuum. He may have a pretty tragic past, but this dude is as dull as cardboard most of the time, and it's weird, because he spouts out the same kind of sarcastic quips and one-liners that a lot of Resident Evil protagonists do, but it somehow doesn't really work this time. It might be because this dude is getting the chair for a crime he didn't commit, manages to break free but is now having to deal with a zombie apocalypse plus leeches, and when he does make it out alive, he's still a wanted man and we never know what happens to Billy after this. All of that baggage in his life, and the only ounce of personality Billy has is this well, what are you gonna do attitude about him. Like, come on, you should probably be at least a little more concerned about your predicament. I'm at the very least glad the game doesn't ship him and Rebecca together at the end, no matter what internet fan art might tell you. They're just strangers who have to work together to survive, and when all's said and done, they go their separate ways, nothing more to it. Believe it or not, even though this is a Resident Evil title, I also don't have that much to say about the voice acting. It's not great, but it's not bad enough to be very entertaining either. It's just kinda wooden for the most part, about on the same level as REmake 1, unless you're Albert Wesker, and especially William Birkin, who's laughably terrible in this game, something I have no problem with whatsoever. Gotta give him credit, Dr. Marcus can be a hoot as well, whether he's opera singing or talking normally. I think this scene during the game's climax speaks for itself with how wonderfully awful he is.
Now I will have my revenge on Umbrella, and the world will burn in an inferno of hate.
You'll pay for what you've done.
We'll see which one of us is gonna die.
That is the most amount of enjoyment I can get out of Resident Evil 0 though, because as well as the story, the gameplay has its own share of issues. When I initially recorded this on the PS4 before upgrading to the PC version, it was my first time playing 0. I had very little knowledge about it outside of having to worry about 2 characters instead of 1, and the only bit of experience I had with this was the opening train section, and then I just put it down for some reason with not a lot of interest in going back. So this video was a great excuse for me to finally finish it. But that sadly only dampened my experience even further. I'm gonna be blunt here. Resident Evil 0 is not a very good game in my opinion. Sure, it does look, play, and feel like a classic Resident Evil, and while it may not be one of the worst times I've had with the game, the multitude of problems Zero has was enough for me to say I wasn't totally fulfilled. As I mentioned earlier, you're controlling both Rebecca and Billy at the same time, and while you can move them simultaneously during the few puzzles that require you to do so, the secondary character will follow you and shoot enemies automatically by default, though you can tell them to hold their fire by accessing the inventory menus. At any point in the game, by tapping the corresponding button, you can also order them to wait at the spot they're currently standing on while you do something else, and then tell them to regroup afterwards, assuming they're in the same room. Otherwise, you'll have to press another button to swap control between characters. That by itself is a pretty neat feature, and not once did the game fail to load the area the other character was in, which is a great technological achievement for GameCube standards, and it's just as well because there'll be a few times at certain points in the story where Billy and Rebecca will become temporarily separated and have to fend for themselves. You just need to be careful there's no immediate danger surrounding them, but you'll hear a cry for help over the radio to let you know if either one of them is in trouble. All you would need to do then is swap to the other character, take care of the threat, and then go about your business. For the most part, this introduction to co-op in the usual formula works fairly well. I don't remember any moments where I was shouting at the AI for getting themselves killed or wasting bullets for a particular gun, because I was able to pick which weapon they currently have equipped and decide whether or not they should shoot, something I wish Resident Evil 5 would do. I'll fess up that I did choose the HD remaster's more modern analog movements as opposed to the series' traditional tank controls, because god, I could not imagine having to use the classic tank setup with two different characters at the same time, especially on the GameCube and that nipple of a C-stick. With proper 360-degree maneuvering, I can get by obstacles with both characters more easily and not have to use up precious resources, though that won't stop you from constantly fumbling around with the inventory menus. Rebecca and Billy each have 6 slots to store things away, meaning 12 in total, which sounds pretty generous for a classic Resident Evil game, but trust me, it's not, because certain weapons and items absolutely necessary for progression can take up 2 slots, when it's always been 1 slot up to now. With that being the case, your inventory is going to fill up very fast, so exchanging items between Billy and Rebecca is going to be required if you want to save the backtracking, but only by so much. I have to make an apology to Code Veronica for thinking it could not get any worse than that game for the constant back and forth you had to do to get a move on with things. No, it's Resident Evil 0 that takes the gold trophy for that because of one reason and one reason only. There are no item boxes this time. Now, something else that Zero introduces is the ability to drop any item and come back for it later, with the maps even pointing out which room has which item, and that's an amazing addition. Item boxes were extremely convenient, but it was always kind of a pain in the ass having to backtrack to the nearest one to put some items away and make room for the items you really want, and then having to go all the way back to where you originally were. Dropping items in theory saves so much time when all you want to do is combine 2 herbs and pick up the items again so that you're not having to return later, but without item boxes, this ends up making the backtracking even worse than it was before. Sure, item boxes in previous games weren't exactly realistic, as if there's some sort of portal inside that magically transports them to other item boxes further into the game, but sometimes you gotta break realism for the sake of fluid gameplay, and Resident Evil 0 makes inventory management so realistic that it stops being fun and more of a nuisance. I think this is supposed to be a callback to Sweet Home for the Famicom, the game that originally inspired Resident Evil, but I've never played it, so I can't say for sure. It certainly feels about as archaic as an old Famicom game, and I don't know why the changes had to happen now of all times when we're right at the end of the classic series. There is an elevator near the end of the game that can take you to all the previous areas you've explored, but that's too little too late. I never thought I'd get tired of the iconic door transitions in an old school Resident Evil game either, but with the amount of times you have to keep going through the same rooms over and over again, I just wanted to zip through a bunch of sections, but the door transitions kept grinding the pace to a halt every few seconds, even when I knew exactly where I was going. It only gets worse when Rebecca and Billy have to find ways to transfer specific items to each other, either providing more ammo or solutions to puzzles, usually by cramming items in a small elevator shaft, but for reasons I won't understand, you can only put in 1 item at a time. Then the other character will need to collect the item, send the elevator back down, switch to the other character so that they can put the next item in, and go through the same cycle until you've transported as much as you want. It's so freaking tedious. Not helping is that Rebecca's the only character that has the capabilities of combining herbs. I guess Stars took a special course on the basics of medicine that's too classified to tell Billy. But Rebecca's likely the one that needs most of the healing anyway, because goddamn is she squishy. One hit on her and her health status goes from green to yellow in an instant. It's like she's made out of glass. Billy can take a few more hits compared to Rebecca and also carries a lighter with him for specific puzzles, so when I'm choosing between the two protagonists, I'm usually having Billy as the lead and with most of the firepower, because you're not going to know what's around the corner your first time around, you've got to be prepared. This is easily the most difficult classic Resident Evil I've played out of all of them. Ammo and healing items are probably the most limited than they've ever been in previous games. I think I counted a total of 3 blue herbs in the entire game, so if you get poisoned by deadly spiders or something like that and you're out of those blue herbs, tough shit, start over. In fact, pretty much all of the enemies in this game have their own way of ensuring that you have an absolutely miserable time. Whether it's zombies trying to bite you, leech monsters that are best killed with fire weapons, the fucking hunters who I especially hate in this game more than any of the others, frogs that show up right the hell out of nowhere, or the godforsaken eliminators. Monkeys that bounce all over the place, are so small to shoot at and very prone to attacking your ankles until you die. And when there are irritating enemies, there are also irritating bosses, and these have to be the worst in the classic series yet. Even with modern analog control, it's difficult not to get hit by certain attacks, with the tighter spaces not helping matters further on a few occasions. The giant bat in the church being a perfect showcase for this. It just keeps flying all over the place, with its lunge attack being the only opportunity to hit it, but do enough damage and its younglings join the fight, and if you have auto-aim enabled, good friggin' luck trying to hit the big one afterwards. Both playthroughs I had to keep putting it in a stun lock until it eventually died, and that's not the essence of a good boss fight, is it? Just a war of attrition? Considering how scarce ammunition is in Zero on top of this, you have to be damn sure you don't waste too many bullets. You'd at least hope that maybe the scenery would give the game some wow points, but even that fails to impress most of the time. They're not bad, but outside of the opening train section, the environments are the same old stuff that we've seen many times in Resident Evil already. Another mansion, more sewers, another factory, and another lab to explore. It's just getting a little tired at this point. The train level was no doubt the highlight, and I wish the rest of the game maintained that sort of quality. It was fresh, corridors were tight to make for some tense encounters, the heavy rain in the darkest night surrounded by forest makes for wonderful atmosphere, and the dim lights give you glimmers of hope as your only way of seeing anything. It's a fantastic set piece, but it's over in about an hour, and we're back to territory that's all too familiar at this point in the series. Actually, aside from the partner system, leeches, and the monsters they take shape in, I can't think of much that sets Resident Evil 0 apart from the rest. I guess if you didn't like the campaign that much, the HD remaster does offer Wesker mode after finishing it, which replaces Billy with a playable Wesker carrying his RE5 look, and some of his superpowers he got in Code Veronica. He can charge up the most deathly of death stares that does incredible damage and can be used as many times as you want. I honestly don't know why he's even given a gun to use, and Wesker can pull off a dash if you just want to breeze through everything. If you didn't enjoy the game as much as I did, this mode may give you some stress relief after the hell you go through normally, but I can only imagine the novelty wears off after a little while. I didn't finish Wesker mode for the record, just got a brief taste of it, and Rebecca's not any different to how she was before, aside from now looking like she's possessed by Wesker, which does look cool, I won't lie. By the end of my second playthrough, however, I was done with Zero and didn't want to complete the entire thing again. There's sort of a mercenaries mode in this too, but this one goes under the name Leech Hunter that you unlock by simply finishing the campaign. You don't rack up points by killing enemies and doing it in a fast enough time, but you do need to find these different colored leech charms and then leave the training facility once you collected all 50 of each. The main things I don't like about it is that the color of the charms are tied to a specific character, so Rebecca can't pick up blue leeches and Billy can't pick up green leeches. On top of that, each of them can only carry a batch of 10 charms per item slot, meaning you're only left with 2 open slots afterwards, which is unnecessarily restricting. Aside from that, it's fine, I suppose. Not something I come back to often, but if your single player experience wasn't quite as sour as I'm making it out to be, then there's more bang for your buck by playing this. Really though, I think this entire game can be skipped and you wouldn't be missing much, unless you're an avid fan who wants to engage in every Resident Evil title you can get your hands on. The story adds very little and the gameplay has a lot of dull repetition and poor inventory management, with the partner system only mitigating it somewhat. Resident Evil 5 would later have a similar partner co-op style of gameplay, and in my opinion does a way better job at it than Resident Evil 0 does, despite having its own set of issues. It also helped that playing with a friend made made it much more enjoyable, which I think was something Zero needed. I don't know how it would work, but I'm certain it would be possible. Apparently, even the N64 prototype supported local co-op, so why not bring it back? Zero does frequently go on sale across all platforms, so you could probably do worse by picking it up, but I definitely would not recommend this as your first one, not just for the complaints I've already made, but for how tough and non-beginner friendly it is as well. Granted, my second playthrough wasn't quite as arduous as my first, since I remembered where some things were, but my god, that initial run is a slog. I strongly recommend you pick up the remake of the first game instead. It is way more enjoyable and worth every penny, on top of costing the same amount as Zero these days.
And if you do happen to really like Resident Evil Zero, I'm sorry that I couldn't match your feelings and hope you still understand where I'm coming from. It always sucks when I encounter a game I didn't particularly have fun with, but I guess I wouldn't be trash or treasure without occasionally looking at the bad. Next time though, we're heading for the big one just in time for the remake. The entry that completely changed Resident Evil, for better or for worse, is entirely up to you, whilst also providing a huge benchmark for gaming in general. In the following video, we're looking at Resident Evil 4, and I have things to talk about with this one. Thanks everybody for watching, stay safe, stay healthy, and take care of yourselves. Took place just before the events of the I did it again. Took place just before the events of the very... Why do I keep swapping between original and very first. For North America and Japan, and then shipped out... Took place just before the events of the... I keep doing it.